This move opens lines for the queen and bishop, controlling central squares and preparing to develop pieces actively. This move directly challenges white's central pawn, establishing symmetry and opening lines for development, leading into many classical and aggressive opening continuations like the Ruy Lopez or Italian game. This move develops a knight towards the center and attacks black's e5 pawn, forcing a response and preparing for kingside castling. This move, the Petrov defense, immediately challenges white's central pawn and develops a knight, aiming for symmetrical play and rapid piece activity. This capture immediately enters the Petrov's defense, a tactical opening where white aims to regain the pawn with central pressure. This move, 3d6, defends the pawn on e5 with a pawn and opens a diagonal for the bishop, preparing to recapture the knight with the pawn if it retreats. This move is a critical juncture in the Petrov's defense where white chooses to recapture the pawn immediately, accepting a symmetrical pawn structure and aiming for an active piece play rather than a material advantage. This move recaptures the pawn and maintains material equality, while developing a piece and challenging white's central pawn structure, a common theme in gambit lines. This move develops the queen to a more active square, supporting the knight on e4 and preparing to castle kingside, while also indirectly defending against the knight's threat on the e-pawn. This move develops the queen to support the knight and prepare for castling while also challenging white's central pawn. This move aims to develop the d-pawn to support the knight and prepare for further pawn advances or castling, while also opening a diagonal for the bishop. Developing the knight to f6 now is a good move as it defends the e4 pawn and prepares to castle, while also controlling key central squares and developing a piece towards the center of the board. This move develops the bishop to a more active square and pins the black knight to the queen, aiming to exploit the resulting tactical imbalances. This move, b6, defends the knight on f6 and prepares to castle kingside, while also developing a piece and contesting the open diagonal for white's bishop. This move develops the knight to a more active central square, reinforcing the e4 pawn and preparing to challenge black's knight on f6. This move challenges white's attacking knight, forcing it to retreat or exchange, and aims to disrupt white's development on the kingside. This exchange removes a knight that was a nuisance, but it also activates black's bishop on g7 and opens the h-file, potentially benefiting black's rook later. This recapture maintains material equality and develops the queen to an active square, preparing for potential central pawn breaks while also protecting the knight on f6. This move solidifies white's central pawn presence, aiming to gain more space and prepare for further development of pieces like the c1 bishop. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, supporting the knight on f6 and preparing to castle kingside. This move leverages the open diagonal to force black's king into a more exposed position, while simultaneously threatening to win material. Developing the knight to d7 defends the pawn on e5 and prepares to connect the rooks, but it allows white to gain time and centralize their pieces effectively. This move develops the bishop to an active square, preparing to castle and supporting a potential knight advance to c5 or e5, while also eyeing the weakened kingside. This pawn push creates a significant weakness on the kingside by opening up lines towards your king, and will likely lead to tactical complications as white seeks to exploit the exposed position. This move prevents the immediate pawn push g4, which would dislodge white's knight and open lines towards the king. Castling kingside solidifies the king's safety and prepares for central pawn breaks or piece development toward the queenside. This move captures a pawn, but opens the white queen to potential attacks and disrupts white's pawn structure, allowing black to develop their pieces actively and target white's exposed queen. Black counters white's queen activity by immediately challenging the opponent's queen on the b-file, initiating pawn play on the queenside to gain active counterplay. This retreat of the queen defends against the immediate threat on b7 while repositioning for potential queenside pressure. This move repositions the queen to a safer square while preparing to contest the center and potentially support a d5 pawn push. This move supports the knight on c3 and prepares to develop the queen's bishop, aiming to improve piece coordination and control central squares. This move challenges white's central pawn and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, opening lines for black's pieces to develop more actively. Castling kingside now secures the king and connects the rooks, preparing to contest the center or launch an attack on the queenside. This move challenges white's central pawn control and opens the d-file, aiming to exploit the queen's potentially exposed position after recapturing. This move repositions the knight to a central outpost, attacking the d6 pawn and preparing to support a d5 push, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain space. This move retreats the bishop to a safer square, but black misses an opportunity to challenge white's queenside pawn majority by advancing the c-pawn. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the f7 square and preparing to support potential pawn pushes on the kingside, while also maintaining a defensive presence in the center. This knight move dynamically challenges white's bishop on c4, aiming to disrupt white's pieces and potentially open lines for black's queen. This recapture reopens white's queen to the center, potentially threatening black's undeveloped queenside and preparing to harass the king if it remains on the queenside. This queen exchange simplifies the position, allowing black to focus on developing a unified pawn structure and exploiting the open c-file with their rooks. This move aims to centralize the knight after the exchange of queens, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially attack white's weakened queenside pawn structure. This move trades off black's active bishop, simplifying the position and aiming to reduce white's attacking potential while accepting a slightly weakened pawn structure. This move repossesses material and exchanges pieces, simplifying the position and heading towards a slightly more favorable endgame for white due to black's compromised kingside pawn structure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal and prepares to contest the open d-file, aiming to exploit black's slightly uncoordinated piece placement. This move activates the rook to the d-file, aiming to control the open file and potentially pressure black's central pawns or the loose knight. On c5, this move clears the d-file for white's rook and opens up black's position for potential pressure along the d-file in the 7th rank. White aims to consolidate their material advantage and activate their remaining pieces by exchanging a pair of rooks and improving the coordination of their own rooks on the central files. This move prepares to activate the king by moving it towards the center, which is standard practice in endgames to support the pawn structure and potentially participate in attacking or defending. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, targeting black's kingside while also preparing to defend the d-pawn. This move re-centers the rook, preparing to challenge the open d-file and potentially support a future road 8 maneuver, while also maintaining an eye on the kingside. This move repositions the rook to an active file, aiming to challenge black's control and prepare for potential pawn advances or piece activity on the kingside. The king's repositioning to f6 aims to connect the rooks and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside or a central pawn break, seeking active counterplay in the endgame. This move initiates an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to open lines for your attacking pieces and create weaknesses in black's defenses. The knight's active repositioning to e6 aims to challenge white's central control and pressure the f4 pawn, while also preparing to support potential pawn advances or counterplay. This pawn sacrifice opens the f-file for the rook and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses on the kingside. This pawn capture opens the h-file for black's rook, creating immediate threats against white's king, while also simplifying the position and potentially leading to an endgame where black's king is more active. This move aggressively exploits the discovered attack on the black king, forcing a favorable exchange of rooks or a positional concession from black. The king seeks refuge on the kingside, escaping the immediate threats on the central diagonal while preparing to connect the remaining rooks. The rook swings to the g-file to attack the uncastled king and prepare for an invasion or to support a future pawn push. The rook is moved to the g-file to challenge white's control and prepare for potential exchanges or to activate itself on the open file. The rook on f5 is aiming to control the f-file, creating attacking possibilities against the black king and potentially supporting a future pawn push or queen maneuver. This move aims to activate the rook and contest the open c-file, creating counterplay and potential threats against white's kingside. The move 32. h4 is a critical decision aiming to exploit the open h-file and create attacking chances against black's king, which is currently in a somewhat exposed position after the recent exchanges. This move challenges white's rook on the c-file and prepares to activate black's own rook, aiming to gain central control and pressure white's isolated d-pawn. This pawn sacrifice on h5 is a bold attempt to open lines for the rook and potentially attack the weakened kingside, but it risks overextending and creating weaknesses if black can consolidate. This move challenges white's rook on the c-file and aims to create counterplay by exploiting the open g-file and the currently exposed white king. This exchange simplifies the position by eliminating a rook pawn for white and opens the g-file, which will be crucial for white's attack on black's king. This pawn capture on e6 opens the f-file for white's rook and king and weakens black's kingside pawn structure. This exchange simplifies the material and clarifies the pawn structure, setting up a potential advantage for white by exploiting black's doubled pawns. This rook recapture on c5 is strategically sound as it maintains material equality and opens a crucial file for the rook to contest on the next move. This move creates a passed pawn on the 6th rank, a significant attacking asset that will require black's full attention and potentially force concessions. The king must now flee the center and seek safety on the kingside, away from the open files and aggressive pawns. The rook on c4 targets the weak pawn on g6 and prepares to contest the c-file, aiming to exploit white's slightly exposed king. This move prepares to challenge the advanced pawn on g6 and potentially create counterplay on the a-file, aiming to complicate white's advantage. This move aims to restrict the black rook's mobility on the queenside, preparing to advance the queenside pawns and potentially create a passed pawn. The king repositions to a safer square on g7, aiming to regroup and prepare for potential endgame maneuvers now that most of the heavy pieces have been exchanged. The rook on c6 is well placed to exploit the pawn weakness on g6 and potentially create a passed pawn or pressure black's king. This move repositions the rook to the d file, preparing to contest the open file and potentially pressure white's pawn on g6 if white decides to advance it further. This checking move is excellent, forcing the black king to a potentially vulnerable square and setting up the rook to support the g-pawn's advance towards promotion. The rook on c7 has been effectively used to force the king into a vulnerable position, and capturing it now leads to an unavoidable checkmate. This move regains the pawn sacrificed earlier, simplifying the endgame and aiming to leverage the superior pawn structure and space advantage for a winning advantage. This check forces white's king to the edge of the board, creating an immediate tactical threat and potentially setting up black to regain material or achieve a more favorable endgame. This move simply repositions the king to safety, avoiding potential checks and preparing for potential endgame play where king activity becomes paramount. Black's move 42, d5 aims to liberate the king and create counterplay by opening lines, although it also exposes the pawn structure to white's rook on the 7th rank. This pawn advance prepares to support the rook's activity and create space, potentially threatening to push further and restrict black's king's movement. This move activates the rook on a critical central file, challenging white's initiative and preparing to support potential pawn advances or even enter the endgame with active pieces. White reinforces the passed pawn on a5, aiming to create a dangerous queenside majority while preventing black's rook from further incursions. Black's rook aggressively repositions to the a file, contesting white's a pawn and preparing to potentially infiltrate or support a future pawn push. The move b4 aims to create an extra passed pawn on the queenside by supporting the advance of the remaining pawns and preventing black's rook from accessing favorable squares. The rook on a4 now eyes the d4 pawn and prepares to pressure white's queenside pawn majority, aiming to disrupt white's defensive structure and create counterplay in the endgame. This move aims to reinforce the central pawn majority and prevent black's rook from activating further along the c-file by controlling the c4 square. This move initiates an attempt to create a passed pawn by pushing the d-pawn forward, aiming to disrupt white's defenses and potentially open lines for black's remaining pieces. White continues to consolidate the advantage in the endgame by centralizing the rook to attack the weak pawn and prepare for further queenside expansion. This pawn capture opens the c-file for black's rook, creating immediate pressure on white's rook and aiming to activate black's queenside majority. This move is a simple pawn capture that simplifies the position and aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside after further exchanges. This rook sacrifice is designed to force the opponent's king into the open and create a dangerous passed pawn on the 7th rank. The move Ra3 aims to support the passed pawn on a4 and potentially restrict black's rook activity. The rook moves to b7, aiming to support the advance of the passed b-pawn while maintaining defensive pressure on white's pawn structure. This move advances the a-pawn, creating a protected passed pawn that aims to disrupt black's defensive structure and force difficult decisions. This move aims to secure the rook on a more active square, potentially supporting an advance of the a-pawn or preparing to contest the open a-file. The rook on a5 controls the 7th rank, restricting black's king and potential pawn pushes from that side of the board, while also supporting white's own passed pawn on the a-file. The rook sacrifice has opened up black's king, and this move aims to centralize the king to defend against white's advancing pawns and potential checks. The move g4 is a prophylactic attempt to restrict black's rook and prepare for a pawn race in the endgame. aiming to create a passed pawn on the kingside while defending against potential counterplay. With white's king now relatively safe and his rook poised to become active on the a-file, black's king must centralize to support his advancing pawns and prepare for the endgame battle. Ahead, the king is now safely centralized, preparing to support the advance of the passed pawn while also defending against potential counterplay. 53. Cade 6. Black's king finally leaves its defensive post and ventures towards the center, aiming to participate in the endgame and potentially contest the c3 pawn or support a passed pawn, if one arises. The king's centralization is key in the endgame. Moving it to f4 prepares to support the potential passed pawn on the kingside and counter black's d-pawn. This move prepares to bring the king to the center to support the pawn push and fight for activity. In the endgame, the king is activated to join the fight for the center and support the advancing pawns. The move 55. Cade 7 is a defensive maneuver aimed at centralizing the king and connecting the rooks, which is essential in this endgame to improve coordination and prepare for potential pawn pushes or exchanges. The move *g5** aims to create a passed pawn on the kingside, potentially activating white's king and queen on the queenside to support it. The move prepares to advance the king further into the center, aiming to support the passed pawn on the a-file and contest the open c-file. The pawn push creates a passed pawn on the g-file, forcing black to dedicate resources to stopping it, potentially weakening their kingside or allowing white's king to advance. The move is aimed at centralizing the king and preparing to defend the a-pawn while also potentially supporting the pawn push on the kingside. This move, capturing the pawn on e6, is a critical decision that simplifies the position into an endgame where white has a significant material advantage and a well-placed king, aiming to promote the passed pawn on the queenside. The rook sacrifice by white on move 57 seems to have aimed at simplifying into a winning pawn endgame, and now black's king must navigate the final moves to avoid being outmaneuvered. This move is a crucial step in creating a passed pawn, aiming to promote it and secure a decisive advantage by exploiting the open file and the vulnerable king. The move forces the white king to a less secure square, aiming to create counterplay with the rook on the 7th rank and potentially attack the now exposed g7 pawn. White's pawn on a now advances to a7, preparing to promote to a queen and force an advantageous endgame, while black's king is too far away to prevent it. The king's desperate check forces the white king to a potentially vulnerable square, but it is ultimately a delaying tactic as the passed pawn on a will soon prove decisive. White's king is now aggressively centralized on f5, an ideal square in the endgame to support the passed pawn's advance and potentially threaten black's king.